She moved quietly, carefully, balancing trays of glasses filled with champagne and water. Stepping lightly over the polished wooden floor, her apron was clean but simple. Her hair was tied back neatly, but a few strands had escaped to frame her face. She was not flashy. She did not try to stand out. She carried herself with a kind of calm that went almost unnoticed, as if she had spent years blending into the background. Her hands were steady, and she moved with a rhythm of experience, lifting glasses, taking orders, and smiling politely whenever someone spoke to her. But inside, she felt a little out of place. Not because of the wedding or the grand hall, but because she always felt invisible in places like this. It was not new to her. She had grown used to going unnoticed, to working hard behind the scenes while everyone else celebrated. There was a part of her that loved to watch people happy, to see their excitement and joy. But there was also a quiet ache. She wondered sometimes if anyone would ever see her for who she truly was. Not just the job she did, the uniform she wore, or the tray she carried. She moved from table to table, offering drinks with a polite smile. A few guests looked at her briefly. Some nodded in thanks, but most were too caught up in their own world to notice her at all. And that suited her. She liked it better this way. Less attention, less chance to be embarrassed or judged. Still, there was something in her that ached for more than just being invisible. She remembered, as she carried another tray, the small piano tucked into the corner of the hall. It was a grand piano, shiny and black, but tonight it sat quietly, almost forgotten. Most people didn't notice it, and those who did probably thought it was just part of the decoration. But she did. She had seen it before, in other halls, in other weddings, and each time she passed it, her fingers itched to play. Music had always been her safe place. The one thing that made the world feel right. Growing up, she had been drawn to music without knowing why. Her first piano lesson had come from a neighbor who noticed how she would hum along to the songs on the radio. Her hands had been small and clumsy at first. She remembered the thrill when she finally pressed the right keys and the notes came together. It was magic. Over the years, she had practiced in secret, at home when no one was watching, hiding her talent as if it were a secret too dangerous to share. People around her had their own ideas about what she should do, work, study, follow a normal path, and music was seen as a hobby, pastime, not something to chase. And so, she learned to tuck it away. Tonight, she walked past the piano several times, balancing her tray carefully as she moved from table to table. Every time she passed it, she felt a tug at her chest. There was a strange mixture of longing and fear. She loved playing, but she had learned long ago that showing her talent came with risk. People could laugh, make fun, or think she was trying too hard. She had seen it happen before. Still, she could not stop glancing at the piano whenever she had a free moment. It was like it called to her, whispering something she could not ignore. At one of the tables, a group of older guests laughed heartily, clinking their glasses together. They told stories that were loud, full of exaggeration, and sometimes even a little mean. She smiled politely as she refilled their water, keeping her head down, her eyes on the glasses. One of them, a man in a dark suit with a mischievous grin, noticed her looking at the piano. He leaned back in his chair and chuckled. "Hey, you there," he called, pointing at her. "Can you play that thing?" His friends laughed along, but he didn't wait for an answer. "I dare you. Come on, show us something." She froze for a moment, her hands gripping the tray a little tighter. The laughter around her sounded louder than it should have. All eyes weren't really on her yet, but she felt them. She felt the weight of their amusement before it even came. The thought of being on display made her stomach twist, and she almost dropped the tray. Her mind raced. Should she laugh it off? Should she ignore it and keep walking? Every instinct told her to retreat, to stay invisible, to keep doing her job and avoid attention. But then something else stirred inside her. A small spark of defiance, the kind that only comes from years of knowing your worth in silence. She looked at the piano again. The black, polished keys seemed to shine under the lights, almost daring her. She realized that she had been waiting for this moment, even if she didn't know it. She had always dreamed, secretly, that someone would notice her talent, not just a neighbor or a friend, but a room full of strangers. a place where her music could fill the air and make people stop and listen. For a moment, she imagined the sound of her fingers moving over the keys, the notes filling the room, changing the energy of the space. The thought made her heart race. She could hear it clearly in her mind, each note precise, flowing, alive. She could feel the power it carried, the way music had always allowed her to speak when words failed. And now, the dare from the guest, though meant as a joke, had given her permission in a strange way. Permission to step out of the shadows and into the moment she had been avoiding all her life. Still, the fear was there. She could feel it creeping up her spine. What if they laughed? What if she failed? What if the moment she had dreamed of for years became a nightmare in seconds? Her hands shook slightly as she balanced the tray. The guests were waiting for her answer, their laughter a quiet pressure against her chest. She took a deep breath, telling herself she could do this. One step at a time. One note at a time. She set the tray down carefully on a nearby table, a soft clink of glasses marking her decision. The man who had dared her leaned forward, raising his eyebrows. "Well," he said, grinning, "going to play, or are you scared?" His tone was teasing, but there was a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. The other guests quieted a little, sensing something might actually happen. The waitress straightened, her back tall, her hands brushing the edge of her apron. She walked slowly toward the piano, each step measured, as if testing the floor beneath her. The room's noise seemed to fade slightly as she approached, her heart pounding louder than the music in her head. She reached the piano and paused, her fingers hovering over the keys. She looked out at the crowd, their faces a mixture of amusement, curiosity, and expectation. She felt their eyes, their judgment, and it made her stomach twist again. But she also felt a deep, steady determination, the kind that comes when you know this is your moment. She sat down carefully, straightened her back, and placed her hands on the keys. Her fingers trembled slightly at first, but then she remembered the countless hours she had spent practicing in secret. The quiet mornings and late nights when no one else was watching. The music that had kept her grounded through hard times. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting herself breathe, letting herself feel the music waiting for her. The hall seemed to grow still, though no one had yet realized it. Even the laughter from the table who dared her felt distant now. It was just her, the piano, and the music that had always been part of her soul. She knew she could play. She knew she had something to share, something that would speak louder than words, louder than doubts, louder than the fear she had carried for so long. Then she pressed the first key. The sound filled the hall, soft at first, but clear and steady. And in that single note, something shifted. The first note hung in the air, delicate but strong, and the room seemed to pause. Conversations that had been loud and lively moments before stopped in mid-sentence. The clinking of glasses faded into a quiet hum as the guests instinctively turned their attention toward the piano. No one had expected her to play, and now, as the single note lingered, there was a strange, almost electric tension in the air. It was as if the music had created a bubble around her, separating her from the world for just a moment, and the entire hall had leaned in to watch. Her fingers moved slowly at first, testing the keys, finding the rhythm that had been with her for so long. The sounds she created were soft, hesitant, almost shy, but there was something about them that made people stop and listen. A few guests leaned forward in their chairs, curiosity replacing their earlier amusement. The man who had dared her still sat at the table, his grin fading into something closer to awe. He tilted his head slightly as if studying her, realizing this was not a joke. His friends exchanged glances, suddenly quiet, unsure how to react. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the music guide her. Her body relaxed, and the nervousness that had gripped her a few minutes before began to melt away. She remembered the countless nights she had spent practicing in silence. Alone in a small apartment, her fingers dancing over the keys as if no one existed in the world but her and the piano. She remembered the way the notes had always felt like words she could not speak aloud, emotions that could not be put into conversation, stories that belonged only to her. Now, she realized, those private moments had prepared her for this. The dare, the curious eyes, The laughter from the table lit all faded as she allowed herself to play freely. Her hands moved faster, more confidently, weaving a melody that rose and fell like a gentle wave. The sound was rich, full of life, and it carried a subtle sadness that tugged at the heart. Guests who had been laughing just moments ago felt a quiet shiver run through them. They had expected something simple, maybe even a little clumsy, but instead, the room was being filled with something that sounded like it had been waiting to exist all along. Some people whispered softly to each other, not wanting to break the spell. "Did she learn that recently?" one asked. "I don't know. She looks like she just works here," another replied, wide-eyed. The group that had dared her exchanged nervous glances, suddenly unsure if their playful joke had gone too far. The music was not just beautiful. It was commanding. It held a presence that made people stop judging and start feeling. Her eyes stayed closed as she played, but she could sense the subtle shifts around her. The guests closest to the piano were leaning in, some with mouths slightly open, some tapping their fingers unconsciously to the rhythm. Even the children at the far end of the room stopped running around and crouched in their seats to listen. The bride and groom, who had been chatting with friends, paused mid-conversation. Their smiles softened, their hands found each other, and they let the music fill the space between them. The melody changed, flowing from soft, delicate notes to bolder, more confident ones. It was as if her story was unfolding in real time, the piano translating the emotions she could never speak aloud. There was nervousness in the gentle passages, but there was also triumph in the louder, faster sections. The hall felt alive in a new way, as if the music had brushed color over a black and white room. People who had come to celebrate the wedding found themselves experiencing something unexpected, something deeply human, something that reached past appearances and wealth, fancy dresses to touch something raw inside. She felt herself relax more with each note, her initial fear transforming into a quiet exhilaration. Every keystroke reminded her of why she had loved music in the first place. Not for recognition, not for applause, but because it allowed her to speak when she had no words. And now, in front of all these strangers, it felt almost magical. The dare that had seemed mocking just moments before had become the key that unlocked this moment. She realized that she had been ready all along. She just needed a spark to remind her of what she could do. The man who had dared her shifted uncomfortably in his seat, suddenly aware of the attention he had drawn to her. He had meant it as a joke, a way to amuse his friends, but now he felt a mix of admiration and embarrassment. She was not just playing. She was commanding the room without a word. He watched as her fingers moved across the keys with ease, producing sounds that seemed impossible for someone who had been just a waitress. He could see the subtle strength in her back, the focus in her hands, the calm determination that radiated from her like a quiet force. Some guests whispered quietly, trying to understand what they were hearing. "She's incredible," one said softly. Another nodded, almost afraid to speak louder, as if saying the words out loud might break the spell. People who had been judging her, who had assumed she was just a server without real talent, were now forced to confront the truth. She had a gift, and it was real. It was something they had never expected to see. And it made them feel something unfamiliar: respect, wonder, maybe even a little humility. As the melody grew, she allowed herself small improvisations, little flourishes that she had only dared to try in the privacy of her own home. The music rose and fell, catching the emotions of the room and turning them into sound. Laughter and conversation had completely stopped. The only sound was her playing. The hall, which had been full of movement and chatter, was now silent except for the notes she produced. The air felt heavy with anticipation, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see where the melody would go next. Her mind briefly flashed to all the moments she had spent doubting herself. The times she had been told to focus on real work, the times she had hidden her talent because someone might laugh, the moments when she had thought her music was meaningless in the bigger world. Now all of that seemed distant, irrelevant. This moment, standing at a piano in the middle of a wedding hall, was proof that her talent mattered. Not because anyone else said so, but because it had the power to reach people, to make them stop and feel, to make them forget their worries for just a few minutes. The melody shifted again, this time softer, almost like a sigh. She let herself explore the quieter side of her music. The gentle notes that carried more emotion than any loud, showy passage ever could. A few guests closed their eyes, letting themselves feel it fully, letting the music sink into the spaces they didn't usually pay attention to. Others leaned their heads on their hands, mesmerized. Even the children were silent, watching her fingers with wide eyes, as if trying to understand how someone could make such beautiful sounds from a simple instrument. The man who had dared her finally spoke, his voice quiet, almost reverent. I didn't know she could do that," he muttered to his friend. There was no smirk, no teasing. Ow. His friend nodded, equally struck. They realized they had underestimated her completely. They had seen her as someone who simply carried trays, someone they could laugh at or tease. And now they understood that they had been completely wrong. Her presence was quiet, yes, but her talent was powerful, undeniable. And raw, she felt the room's energy shifting around her. The initial skepticism, the whispers, the playful dares, they all melted away. What remained was pure attention, pure focus, pure appreciation. She could sense it, feel it, even if no one spoke. Her hands moved faster now, more confidently, exploring the full range of the piano, letting the music swell and fill every corner of the hall. The notes rose like waves, then fell like gentle rain, carrying emotion that seemed almost too big for the room to hold. When she glanced up briefly, she saw it reflected in the faces around her. The bride's eyes were wide with amazement. The groom's jaw was slack, and he held the bride's hand tightly. Guests who had whispered jokes moments before were now leaning forward, silent, their eyes fixed on her. She realized that the music had changed everything. The atmosphere, the energy, the way people saw her, all of it was transformed. And she felt it too. A quiet pride, a sense of belonging, a feeling that she had finally stepped into the space where she was meant to be. As the last few notes of this passage faded into silence, she allowed herself to breathe. The hall was not yet clapping, not yet cheering. The silence hung heavy, as if everyone were catching their breath, afraid to break the spell. And in that silence, she felt something new: confidence. Fear still lingered, yes, but it no longer ruled her. She had faced the dare, faced the eyes of the room, and shown them something they could not ignore. The first part of her performance was done, and already the world felt different. No one moved at first. The guests sat frozen, processing what they had just witnessed. Some faces showed disbelief, some joy, some quiet admiration. Even the man who had dared her seemed unsure whether to speak, laugh, or bow in respect. Then, slowly, a few people began to clap, quietly at first, as if testing the waters. Others joined in, louder this time, until the hall was filled with genuine applause. She smiled softly, a little shy, a little proud, and sat back, letting the moment wash over her. She realized that the dare, which had seemed like a joke at first, had given her the push she needed. It had forced her out of the shadows, into a space where her music could shine, and she knew even now that this was just the beginning. There were more notes to play, more stories to tell, and more moments to capture. But for now, she allowed herself to enjoy the quiet triumph, the unexpected respect, and the realization that sometimes a single moment could change everything. The first note had barely faded when a hush fell over the room. For a moment, it was as if time itself had stopped. Guests who had been talking, laughing, and moving about paused mid-step, mid-laugh, mid-toast. They all turned toward the piano, their eyes widening as they took in the scene. A waitress, someone who had seemed like part of the furniture for most of the evening, was now seated at the grand black piano, her fingers hovering over the keys. Her hands trembled slightly, betraying a nervousness that her calm exterior had hidden. But there was something else there, too. Something steady. Something daring. The man who had challenged her leaned back in his chair, a nervous grin tugging at his lips. What had started as a joke, a playful dare to amuse his friends, suddenly felt very different. He had expected clumsy notes, maybe a stumble, a moment of embarrassment to laugh at, but what he saw instead made him pause. She looked like she belonged there, her body poised, her fingers ready. Her eyes closed for just a moment, as if listening to a song that only she could hear. The laughter that had bubbled from the table before the dare disappeared, replaced by quiet curiosity. Her first few notes were soft, delicate, like the gentle touch of a breeze on a quiet morning. They did not scream for attention, but somehow they captured it. Guests turned their heads instinctively, their conversations stopping as the sound spread through the hall. The piano, long ignored, suddenly became the center of the room. People who had been distracted by their phones or their conversations now leaned in, their ears attuned to the melody. Even the children, who had been running around, now sat still, captivated. The waitress's heart pounded. She could feel every eye in the room on her, but instead of panicking, she let the music guide her. Years of practice, mostly in secret, came rushing back. She remembered quiet mornings at home, sitting at a small worn piano, playing pieces that only she would hear. Those moments, private and sacred, had taught her more than she realized. Now, in front of all these strangers, the skills she had honed in solitude began to shine. Her fingers moved with confidence, even if her mind still buzzed with nerves. The melody grew slowly, carefully, each note weaving into the next. She allowed herself small flourishes, improvisations she had only dared to try when no one was watching. The music swelled, rising and falling, carrying with it an emotion that seemed to seep into the air around her. Guests felt it, even if they didn't understand why. Some shifted in their chairs, unconsciously leaning closer to the piano, as if proximity could bring them closer to the magic she was creating. A few whispers floated through the crowd. "She's amazing," one guest said, almost afraid to speak too loudly. Another shook their head in disbelief. "I didn't know she could play like that," someone else murmured. The man who had dared her swallowed hard. He had expected amusement, not admiration. He realized now that this moment was far beyond his control, far beyond anything he could have predicted. The waitress was no longer just a server. She was the room's center, the heartbeat of the evening. As she played, her confidence grew. The nervous tremble that had been in her hands at the first note had vanished, replaced by certainty. Each key she pressed resonated with emotion, with stories she could not put into words. She felt a quiet joy at sharing this part of herself, something she had kept hidden for so long. And with each note, the room transformed. Laughter and chatter, which had filled the hall moments before, had been replaced by stillness and wonder. The air itself seemed charged with the music, vibrating softly around the walls and over the heads of the captivated guests. Her fingers moved faster now, dancing over the keys and patterns she had practiced 100 times yet somehow felt new. The music grew bolder, louder, more expressive. She let herself explore the full range of the piano, from the low, resonant notes that rumbled like distant thunder to the high, crystalline tones that sparkled like sunlight on water. Each note seemed alive, carrying with it a piece of her story. A glimpse into the world she rarely shared. The guests could feel it. The bride, standing nearby with her partner, paused in her conversation, her hands clasped together, her eyes fixed on the piano. The groom leaned slightly forward, as if trying to absorb every sound. Even the older relatives, who had been quietly skeptical of the entertainment, now sat upright, listening intently, their expressions softening. The music was bridging a gap, connecting people who had come to celebrate a wedding with a stranger whose presence they had barely noticed. The man who had dared her looked around at the reactions of those at his table. He could see their amazement mirrored in his own face. The whispers that had begun were now hushed gasps, and some guests were exchanging looks of disbelief. No one had expected a server to play like this. He realized that his dare, meant as a joke, had unleashed something extraordinary. He felt a strange mix of pride, embarrassment, and awe. Pride because he had unintentionally given her the push she needed, embarrassment for underestimating her, and awe at the talent that had just filled the room. She allowed herself a brief glance around. Faces filled with wonder stared at her, some shyly, some openly, some unable to tear their eyes away. She caught the eye of a young girl near the back, who was watching with wide, bright eyes. The girl's expression mirrored a mix of awe and inspiration, and the waitress felt a small smile tug at her lips. She realized then that what she was doing was bigger than herself, that this moment was touching people in ways she hadn't anticipated. The melody shifted again, softer this time, more intimate. She played with a tenderness that drew the listeners in, almost as if she were whispering secrets through the piano. Guests leaned in slightly, their attention unwavering. The children, who had been still earlier now, rested their heads on their parents' shoulders, listening with rapt attention. The older relatives closed their eyes, letting the music carry them back to memories they hadn't thought about in years. Even the table that had dared her seemed mesmerized. Their earlier teasing forgotten entirely, her confidence grew with each note. She had been nervous at the beginning, unsure of how the dare would turn out, but now she felt a quiet power. The music flowed naturally, effortlessly, and she realized that she was no longer playing for anyone but herself. The room would listen, and they would respond, but the music was hers to create. The realization gave her a deep, steady calm that allowed her to play even more freely. She began to explore more daring passages, letting her fingers move faster, her hands leap across the keys with precision. The energy in the room shifted with her. Guests felt the excitement building, their hearts responding to the crescendo of sound. Laughter and conversation were completely absent now. Instead, there was silence, heavy with anticipation. The music had captured everyone's attention, drawing them into a shared experience that was intimate and personal. Even in a crowded hall, the man who had dared her finally spoke again, his voice quiet, almost reverent. I had no idea she could do that," he said, looking around at his friends, who nodded in agreement. There was no laughter, no teasing, only respect. He realized that he had underestimated her completely, that her quiet presence had masked a depth of talent he could not have imagined. The music swelled again, and she allowed herself to fully embrace it. Her emotions flowed into the notes, carrying with them every moment of doubt, every hidden fear, every private joy she'd experienced in years of practicing alone. Guests could feel it, even if they could not put it into words. Some had tears in their eyes. Others felt a lump form in their throats, moved by the unexpected beauty of what they were witnessing. The bride and groom, standing near the piano, exchanged a glance. Their smiles were wide, but there was awe in their eyes. This was not the kind of wedding entertainment they had expected. It was far more than that. It was a gift, a moment that would linger in their memories long after the music had ended. They held each other's hands tightly, letting the sound wash over them, carrying a mix of surprise, admiration, and deep emotion. By now, the hall was completely quiet. Every guest's attention fixed on her. The children had stopped fidgeting. The older relatives had stopped whispering. And the man who had dared her was leaning forward slightly, watching in amazement. The music was filling the room in a way that was impossible to ignore. It had shifted the energy completely, turning a casual, elegant wedding into a moment of shared wonder. The waitress allowed herself a small smile as she played. She could feel the room responding to her, feeding her energy as much as she fed theirs. The nervousness that had gripped her at the beginning of the evening had vanished completely. In its place was a quiet joy, a sense of belonging, and the knowledge that she was doing exactly what she was meant to do in that moment. Her fingers danced across the keys with grace and confidence, each note deliberate, each phrase carefully shaped. The music carried a story, one that no one could name but everyone could feel. It spoke of quiet strength, hidden talent, courage, and the beauty that can emerge when someone finally steps into the light. The guests were transfixed, caught in a moment that none of them had anticipated but that they would never forget, as she reached the final passages of her piece. The room seemed to hold its collective breath. The notes became softer, gentler, a quiet resolution that left everyone feeling both satisfied and longing for more. The last note lingered, hanging in the air like a delicate echo, and then silence returned. For a brief moment, the hall was completely still. Then, slowly, the first claps began, quiet at first, hesitant, as if no one wanted to break the spell. But then, like a ripple across water, applause spread. growing louder and louder until the entire room was clapping, cheering, and whistling in genuine admiration. She smiled, a mixture of relief, pride, and humility washing over her. In that moment, she realized that the dare that had terrified her, that had made her heart race and palms sweat, had become the catalyst for something incredible. She had stepped out of the shadows, and in doing so, she had touched the hearts of everyone in that room. And she knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. The music had changed the room completely. What had started as curiosity and surprise had grown into a deep, shared experience. Guests who had been skeptical or distracted were now leaning in, their faces intent, their breaths quiet, as if even the slightest noise would disturb the moment. The hall no longer felt like a wedding reception. It had transformed into a space of shared wonder. Each person caught in the spell of the music coming from the grand, black piano. The waitress's fingers flew over the keys with confidence and grace. The notes were no longer soft or hesitant. They rang out boldly, filling every corner of the hall. Each chord seemed to carry emotion, not just from her, but from every hidden story she had ever lived. She could feel it in her own chest, the rhythm of her heart matching the rhythm of the music. She let herself go, trusting the piano and trusting the moment. Every note she played had a purpose. Every pause had meaning, and the room responded as though it were part of her performance. Some guests gasped quietly, caught off guard by the depth of feeling in her playing. Others sat motionless, their eyes wide, hands clutched in their laps or resting against the table as if they needed something to hold on to. The bride and groom had stopped moving entirely, standing together near the center of the room, their hands intertwined. Their eyes were locked on the pianist, and their expressions showed awe and gratitude. They had not expected entertainment like this. They had expected something light, maybe cheerful. But this was extraordinary. The children at the back of the hall, who had been restless earlier, now sat still, mesmerized by the sound. Their tiny faces were serious, almost as if they understood the gravity of what was happening. One little girl's mother gently brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, and the girl did not move, her eyes fixed on the moving hands above the piano keys. She was learning something important without even realizing it. That true talent can come from anywhere, that it can surprise you, and that sometimes the quietest people carry the loudest gifts. The guests who had once whispered jokes, or dared her to play now, sat in stunned silence. The man who had challenged her could not hide his amazement. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, watching her with a mixture of awe and regret. He realized that he had underestimated her completely. What he had thought would be a fleeting moment of amusement had become a profound display of skill, emotion, and courage. His friends around him nodded quietly, their earlier smirks replaced by faces of respect. As the melody swelled, the room seemed to breathe with it. Each note echoed off the walls. Each chord resonated deep in the bones of the listeners. The air itself seemed charged, vibrating with the emotion she poured into the music. The hall, which had moments ago felt formal and distant, now felt intimate and alive. It was no longer a wedding reception. It was a shared journey, an experience everyone in the room would carry with them forever. The waitress closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting herself feel the energy. She could sense the emotions of the room, the surprise, the admiration, the joy, the awe. It was overwhelming in the best way possible. She allowed herself to smile slightly, but she did not slow down. The music demanded her full attention, and she was eager to give everything she had. Every key she pressed was deliberate. Every note carried intention. She was no longer playing to prove herself. She was playing because this was where she belonged. A few guests could not contain themselves. One elderly man slowly stood, leaning on his cane, his eyes glistening with tears. He whispered softly, more to himself than anyone else. "I've never heard anything like this," another guest. A woman with her hands clasped near her heart felt her chest tighten. Overwhelmed by the beauty and emotion of the music, people who had been laughing, joking, or distracted earlier were now fully present. The piano had captured them, and for the first time that evening, everyone was truly together in a shared experience. The bride and groom's friends began to quietly murmur to each other, exchanging looks of disbelief. "She's incredible," one said. "I've never seen anyone play like that in my life," replied another. They felt a mixture of admiration and gratitude. They realized that they were witnessing something unique, something rare, a moment in time that would stay with them forever. Some even felt a twinge of regret that they had not noticed her earlier, that they had overlooked the quiet young woman who had been moving through the crowd so unobtrusively. The music shifted again, this time taking on a more playful tone. Her fingers danced across the keys with speed and precision, hitting notes that rang out with clarity and emotion. The room responded almost instantly. Guests leaned in, caught by the energy, some tapping their fingers along to the rhythm, some smiling broadly at the sudden liveliness. Even the children began to sway slightly, caught up in the rhythm without realizing it. The man who had dared her laughed softly, shaking his head in disbelief, still amazed by how effortlessly she had captured the attention of the room, despite the applause that had broken out earlier. The music did not falter. It seemed to grow stronger, more confident, as if fed by the energy of the room itself. Each chord she struck resonated with purpose, carrying a mixture of joy, passion, and a quiet strength. She could feel the weight of the moment, the responsibility of holding the attention of so many people, but she also felt exhilarated. The music was no longer just notes. It was a bridge connecting her to every person in the hall. Telling a story without words? She glanced briefly at the audience, seeing the faces of people she had once considered strangers transformed by the experience. The man who had dared her watched silently, now deeply respectful, as if he had just witnessed something sacred. The bride had tears in her eyes, holding her partner's hand tightly, feeling the weight and beauty of what was happening. Guests who had been skeptical, who had thought her talent limited or insignificant, were now leaning forward, entranced, fully aware that they were witnessing a rare gift. The room's energy continued to evolve. The initial awe and surprise had given way to deep emotional engagement. Some guests wiped away quiet tears. Others sat upright, mouths slightly open, caught by the intensity and passion of the performance. The music was no longer background. It was the center of their experience, guiding their emotions and drawing them into the story she was telling. Each note carried weight, each phrase brought a new layer of meaning, and the audience responded instinctively. Completely immersed, the pianist allowed herself to explore the piano fully, moving from soft, introspective passages to bold, dramatic sequences. She played with a freedom she had rarely felt outside her private practice. This moment, sparked by a simple dare, had become a space where she could express herself completely, where fear had no hold, and where her music had the power to touch everyone around her. The more she played, the more alive she felt, the more alive the room became. Some guests could not hide their astonishment. Whispers of admiration traveled quietly across tables. "She's amazing," one said. "I can't believe she's just a server," whispered another. Even those who had been quietly observing from the back of the room were leaning forward now, eyes wide, absorbing every note. The music had dissolved every pretense, every social barrier, every sense of hierarchy. In that hall, for that moment, everyone was equal. United by the piano and the hands that played it, the man who had dared her finally stood, clapping softly at first, then more loudly, his friends following suit. His earlier teasing had vanished entirely, replaced by genuine admiration. He realized that he had witnessed something extraordinary, something rare and powerful. The act of challenging her had led to a moment none of them would ever forget. It was no longer a dare. It was a revelation. As the performance reached its peak, the pianist allowed herself to play with abandon. Her fingers moved with speed and precision, striking chords that filled the hall with a rich, resonant sound. The guests felt the emotion of the music in their bones as if it had a life of its own. People who had been reserved or skeptical were now completely engaged. Some swaying slightly, some clasping their hands, some closing their eyes to absorb the full impact of the moment. And then, as the music began to draw toward its final notes, she slowed slightly, allowing the melody to soften. The energy in the room shifted from exhilaration to quiet reflection. The notes lingered in the air, delicate and precise, carrying the weight of everything she had expressed. The guests were silent, caught between the beauty of the music and the realization that it was coming to an end. When the final note faded, a heavy, profound silence fell. The room was still, every person processing what they had just experienced. It was not just applause they felt, it was awe, respect, and a quiet reverence for the talent and courage they had just witnessed. Slowly, the first claps began, soft and hesitant, then growing, spreading across the hall until the room erupted into heartfelt applause, cheers, and whistles. Guests stood, some moved to tears, others smiling broadly, all united in admiration for the young woman who had transformed the evening with her music. The waitress sat back, breathing deeply, overwhelmed but quietly proud. She had stepped out of the shadows, faced the challenge, and created something that no one could ignore. The room was forever changed, and she felt, for the first time in a long time, that she belonged not as a server, not as a background figure, but as a creator, a storyteller, and someone whose presence and talent could move people in ways words never could. The applause still echoed through the hall. Yet she sat quietly at the piano, her fingers resting lightly on the keys, feeling a mix of exhilaration and disbelief. The room had been transformed by her music. Every face turned toward her in a way that no one had ever looked before. The laughter, chatter, and casual conversation that had filled the space earlier were gone, replaced by respect, admiration, and a sense of awe. She could feel it in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the lights or the music, but everything to do with the moment she had created and shared. Guests began to stand. Some slowly, some more impulsively, all clapping and cheering in genuine appreciation. It was not polite applause or fleeting courtesy. It was heartfelt. People she had never spoken to, people who had only seen her as the waitress moving between tables, were now approaching her with smiles. Some with tears in their eyes, others with hands extended in gratitude. The energy of the room had shifted completely. She was no longer invisible. She had stepped into a light that was hers, and no one could take it away. The man who had dared her approached cautiously, a mixture of awe and humility on his face. His earlier teasing had vanished entirely, replaced with something he could not hide: respect. I'm sorry, he said quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. I didn't mean for it to turn out like this. I had no idea. His words were awkward, but genuine. She smiled softly at him, a quiet understanding in her eyes. She had known all along that the dare was not cruel at its core, only thoughtless. And yet it had been the push she needed. Without it, perhaps this moment would never have happened. Other guests followed, some offering heartfelt words of praise. That was incredible, said one woman, shaking her head as she tried to find the right words. I've never heard anything like that in my life. Another guest nodded in agreement. You should play more often. The way you bring the room to life. It's remarkable. She felt a flush of warmth at their words, but it was quiet and contained. She had not played for recognition or for applause. She had played because it was who she was, because music had always been a part of her soul. And now, finally, the world had noticed. The bride approached her, her face shining with excitement and gratitude. That was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard, she said, her voice soft but firm. Thank you for sharing it with us. You've made this day unforgettable. The waitress nodded, her hand still resting on the piano. She felt a lump in her throat, a mixture of pride, relief, and quiet happiness. The bride's words, simple and sincere, carried more weight than any applause ever could. It was recognition of her talent, her courage, and the heart she had put into every note. Guests continued to approach her, each one wanting to share a word, a smile, or a gesture of appreciation. She moved with grace and quiet humility, thanking them, nodding, and smiling. She did not boast, did not demand attention, but she accepted it in the way she had always dreamed she could. Each interaction reinforced what she already knew in her heart. Her music had the power to touch people, to connect with them in a way nothing else could. Some of the guests who had been skeptical at the beginning were now full of admiration. They asked questions, curious about how long she had been playing, where she had learned, and if she had performed before. She answered simply, without embellishment, explaining that she had practiced for years, mostly in private. They listened, fascinated, realizing that talent could exist in places they had never thought to look. Their earlier judgments, their assumptions about her, had all been proven wrong. It was a humbling moment for everyone in the room. She glanced around the hall, taking in the scene. The tables, once lively with casual chatter, were now filled with people standing or leaning forward, clapping, smiling, and talking quietly about what they had just witnessed. The air felt lighter, charged with joy and appreciation. There was an energy in the room that could not be contained, an invisible connection that had formed between her and everyone present. She realized that the music had not only told her story, but had also created a moment of shared humanity.